Outlast is an incredible game from 2013 that, for some people, redefined what an indie horror game could be. And while it was followed up by some amazing games like The Evil Within and Alien Isolation only a year later, but notably with a much larger scope and scale, Red Barrel still swam in their success. However, they wouldn't go on to release the sequel Outlast 2 until 2017. And while the first game sits at a 96% positive rating on Steam with over 71,000 reviews, and Outlast 2 sits at a still impressive 91% positive at around 35,000 reviews. So while both games are generally well received, I'm very much siding into the camp that Outlast 2 is a great sequel, but a much lesser game overall than the first. My name is Falling Hurts. Right now we're going over the Outlast series. I've already done a video on the first game, as well as another video on the DLC and the Insanity mode, in preparation for the Outlast Trials, which I've also done videos on, which is going into early access in May. So strap in for my 2023 review of Outlast 2. As always, we've got the story, the gameplay, the visuals, and the audio. But the first thing that I wanted to break down, which is a little different than my usual format, is the scare factor. And quite simply, I think all of the elements that I'm going to be breaking down throughout this video come together to make a pretty terrifying game, one that got me even on a second playthrough years later. It's a pretty straightforward game as far as the horror goes. There's not as many jump scares as the first game, but a lot of the horror comes from the unknown. Whether you're in a cornfield surrounded by people, or so you think you're surrounded, this is where the horror of this game comes from. The way the storytelling plays out is another way that it plays into that fear, but with that being said, let's go ahead and get right into the story of the game. The narrative of Outlast 2 is interesting for sure. The religious undertones of the first game are here again, but on center stage. Personally, for my own taste, this is a bit exhausting. Another instance where I believe that religious elements can tie really well into horror storytelling is Dead Space, or in my instance, Dead Space Remake. But I think that it just does it better than Outlast 2, in my opinion. But I believe the heavy emphasis on religion both ties into Blake's story with, the kind of background information that we'll get into in just a little bit, as well as pushing the idea that anything that the evil Murkoff Corporation is going to do is going to twist the minds of its subjects in one way or another and cause some crazy types of reactions. In this case, being extreme behavior and religious zealotry. I do like, and one thing I will say is that throughout this game, you're going to see a lot of really crazy things happening. For instance, you're going to see birds falling dead from the sky, and you're going to think, man, this is almost kind of like a mirror to some of the biblical prophecies. But I don't think that these themes are strong enough to maintain a leading role in the play. Now, we play as Blake Langerman, and he's here with his wife Lynn to try and do some hard investigative reporting on a lead where a pregnant woman showed up nearby where she was strangled. Of course, things go wrong as any horror movie or horror game does, and the couple are separated and a night of terror ensues for them both. As we navigate through the malformed civilization, we'll find both notes and moments of interest that Blake will record with his camcorder. The notes can range from an uneasy citizen speaking of treason against the church, all the way to new religious scripture exclusively found here in Arizona. It definitely helps that you'll find many of these notes in a place like a slaughterhouse or even next to the body of whoever wrote it, and it really does help develop a sense of place and relevance to the story of whatever information you're actually reading, and most importantly, how it fits into the world. As I also mentioned, there are moments that Blake will record, and you can now watch these moments back on the camera whenever you want, and you're going to get some insight into what he's feeling at the time. Much like the notes from the first game, but vocalized. Personally, I like that Blake was more natural when he's speaking, and it makes more sense that he's talking rather than just writing stuff down while running from crazies. But I can't help but feeling that like there is some substance missing from these handwritten notes. I feel like we got more out of Miles through these written pieces rather than what Blake is saying. Blake is more reactionary, where Miles is talking past, present, and future about things that he's witnessed or things that he's seeing, or even writing it like he's already going to be found dead. I don't know, maybe he was just the better journalist. You could say that he was Miles better. And while there is a clear narrative to follow in the main timeline, there's also a secondary timeline where Blake relives a traumatic time from his childhood. These moments act as a pacing divider and even a plot reset point for the main timeline of the game. But honestly, this is some of the most interesting stuff in the whole experience for me. Not to spoil these sections, as I won't be doing with most of the later portions of the game, but the school has one of my favorite scares in gaming, and also such a unique and harrowing depiction of our protagonist's backstory. And better yet, it still makes sense that we're experiencing it in real time. It doesn't convolute the story in any crazy major ways. It just fits into the world and into the rules that we're living in. Overall, these sections are really great. But there's one point about 2/3 of the way through the game where the school sequence and the real-time sequence don't quite match up in tempo or tone, and it resolves itself with new story revelations pretty quickly, but the gameplay, and especially the tone here, really do suffer because of it. Another point I find myself debating on if I like or not is the way the game handles its antagonists. On one hand, the designs are way more unique in Outlast 2 over the original, but I feel like the characters aren't fun necessarily to encounter anymore. What I mean by that is in the first game you had a character like Richard Traeger, who was charismatic and funny, and who worked in opposition of Chris Walker, who was the kind of hulking and ever-looming threat of the first game. In Outlast 2, there's a bigger emphasis on making these baddies creepy, for sure, but less, in my opinion, on making them any form of memorable. Outside of that, though, I do have to give some props for the overall more involved narrative. A minor criticism I did have of the first game was that why didn't Miles just turn around after he got a little bit of creepy footage in the rundown asylum? You can't break a story if you're dead, but what does he do? He keeps going. Well, Blake does too, enduring new emotional and physical traumas that are depicted so vividly that at one point I actually did feel a phantom tingle in my hand. But fortunately here, Blakey Boy has actual good reasons at all times. Not only is he stranded, but also his wife is in the limelight of the new Joel Osteen 2.0 church. I don't think anyone outside of America is really going to get that one, so I apologize if you're seeing that. But as I walk away feeling pretty mixed on kind of the story delivery overall, I have to say that in the end, I do enjoy it. It's just something that you have to be in the right mood for, which unfortunately, in my opinion, does hurt the game, and it doesn't make me want to play it anywhere as near as much as the first game. But speaking of playing, I think now we should finally tackle the gameplay. At a base level, you're working with the same toolset that the series has become known for. You've got sprinting, crouching, jumping, and of course the use of the camera for night vision. And while I believe just simple refinements to the formula would have kind of been a bit of a letdown, I'm happy to say that I like the many additions made to Outlast 2 overall. But a few tweaks here and there really do keep the experience from being perfectly smooth in my opinion. So with the new stuff, we have the removal of regenerating health and the addition of bandages as a secondary resource to batteries. And speaking of collecting, as I said, there's a new interface for viewing papers and recordings, all from the camcorder screen where we can look down and see our collectibles, our batteries, and bandages all in one diegetic presentation that I absolutely love. To me, there's nothing better for immersion than a good sense of presence and place within the world. That's something I'm going to bring up a lot, especially during horror reviews. Also, these recordings can be viewed from the main menu at any point, which is just super convenient. The additions don't end there though for your gameplay, as mobility has seen a lot of changes. It's been both increased and also unfortunately nerfed in certain aspects as well. They've added the ability to crawl and go prone, which results in some claustrophobic chases that feel tense by nature, but when you're wanting to avoid a chase, you can just crouch in the water to submerge yourself, where you'll need to try and time holding your breath until enemies have passed by. A really cool visual part here is that you can see their flashlight scanning over the water, and if you still see that, you'll know they're still there. Personally, I really like the water hiding in general, but I think the swimming aspect of the game just doesn't feel as good, and it never feels like you're moving fast enough, which I guess maybe Blake's just a really bad swimmer. You know, that's not for me to know. Another instance where you just want to go faster is anytime that you're running with your camera on. To me, the biggest change from the first game that I noticed instantly was that the camera being used actually decreases your running speed, and I hate this. I can't say it doesn't make sense, as you're going to have to try to, like in real life, you'd have to focus to hold the camera in front of your face properly, but it definitely eliminates some of the fun factor of these chases, in my opinion. The camera does get an upgrade though with the audio finder functionality, where you can detect far away or unseen sound sources. And I'll talk a little bit more about how it works in the audio section, but quite frankly, I just didn't use the feature hardly at all. At least the submerge feature that I talked about earlier was useful throughout the game and felt justified, but the listen features really only required maybe 1 or 2 times to navigate extremely dark environments. Now, the actual player movement and arsenal weren't the only things that changed for the sequel though. With the new setting featuring a far more open-ended philosophy with locations like fields, large buildings, caves, and more, I couldn't help but notice that we're still just as narrow in our actual progression, which is fine. It actually works really well for the first game, but even in Mount Massive Asylum, you found yourself collecting fuses and keys in larger areas to move forward. And with that came the ability for the player to subconsciously become familiar with the dark environment. meaning that when shit hits the fan, and trust me it will, they would at the very least have some kind of bearing of where to go already. This is satisfying to the player, and something I couldn't really put my finger on for the longest time, but I realized that Outlast 2 really just doesn't have any of this at all. There's a few moments where it kind of does, but that's about it. Combine this with the changes I mentioned about the camera being held up and slowing you down, and it really doesn't come off as super fun. Most of the time, these chases come off as scripted, which is fine. Scripted chases are always cool, but again, this time around, you don't always know where you're going. You're mostly just looking for that guiding, slightly lighted way as you sprint to put a distance between you and your pursuers. Sure, you can sneak by some unsuspecting enemies, but you're never even circling back, so I don't even know why you would bother sneaking. You could run past everyone. Now, before you say, and I can hear it, now I think that being unfamiliar territory is actually more scary. Yes, technically, you're right. I think the split decision making that you make in these chases where you don't know where you're going or where you could hide definitely does have a charm to it. However, being the whole game, it's just exhausting at the end. The AI in this game is incredibly deadly, especially on higher difficulties, and there's little margin for error, and it's very quickly going to result in a restart to checkpoint, which, last time I checked, is not fun for anyone. Ultimately, I believe the tools and tricks added to Outlast 2 are great in concept, but due to the poor implementation into the narrative and even into the environment, the level gameplay design really betrays these new upgrades. In my opinion, environments that allowed us to have a little bit more to roam around, as well as more of a need to use the audio listening or even the submerged features would go a long way in making these changes feel more justified. But speaking of the technicals, one tool that Red Barrels clearly used efficiently was Unreal Engine. Specifically, at the time, Unreal Engine 3. And when the first game came out, this was pretty standard to use Unreal Engine 3. But by the time Outlast 2 came out in 2017, it was considered as old as a 25-year-old dating Leonardo DiCaprio. With most developers having moved on to Unreal Engine 4, Red Barrels seemed determined to prove their knowledge of this engine. And I gotta say, goddammit, they did a really good job. The game, to this day, is visually stunning at max settings. Specifically, the moonlight and the way it pours over so much of the valley is incredible. Another standout to me personally were the flame effects. Whether it be a campfire or a standing torch as you pass by, the fires of the game leave literally nothing to the imagination as far as realism is concerned. And speaking of real, as I mentioned in the Outlast DLC review, I talk about how they're always pushing their implementation of new camera angles and different things like that forward. In this instance, one thing that you'll see throughout the game is Blake could lose his glasses during, a scripted scene, of course, but seeing the blurry image as he puts the glasses back on and then going back to clear is really cool and like a nice touch. I don't know, it's nothing more, but it's just one of those things that adds a lot of character to the game, and I really do like that. Now, not everything is real though, as effects like blood rain, psychic flashbangs, and even visualizations of childhood trauma taking place in a Catholic school setting where the protagonist returns periodically to face his past within his present all look absolutely incredible. I know that took me like 4 times to say that and not like mess up my sentence structure, because guess what? That was a fucked up sentence, but it was a joke, so it's fine. But really, it can't be overstated just the wide variety, especially even compared to the earlier games, that this game actually throws out you visually and how well it handles each and every one of those aspects. Character designs look better than ever, and it's evident pretty much off the bat. Lynn, the wife, looks great, the townsfolk look unsettling, and most importantly, the main bad guys all have detailed and meaningful concepts and looks. With the visuals picking up where the writing may have failed them, each of the enemies of Outlast 2 feature disturbing and uncomfortable features. Whether it be our God-fearing apostles or their mud-covered enemies, there's truly something to be said about the visual identity of Outlast 2 and its factions, and I almost wish that there was a sense of camaraderie with a faction. That way, when you're in the dark and it's hard to tell these guys apart, maybe some of them won't attack at you and some of them will, and you don't know in a crowded environment. That would be something really cool to see. Now, regrettably, one place that I did find issue with was poor facial animations and some of the animations overall. And before we go any further, I would like to say that the first-person animations of the game all look and feel really well done, so don't think that the majority of the game is going to be any issue as far as animations go whatsoever. Think of this more of a nitpick. But characters, of course, move and idle quite well throughout the world as well. But unfortunately, up close, they just don't hold up to those same standards. Evident almost right away in the opening cutscene, Lynn shows off so much character, but everything still feels pretty stiff. If this is keyframed animation, there was a lot of work put into it for sure. As I said though, a big issue I have in games is when seeing someone up close and they have the occasional lifeless eyes or weird mouth syncing. Otherwise though, characters chase you and skulk around quite convincingly in the game. So it's just these up close moments that don't look so good. Now, one thing I did want to point out though, later in the game, some of this quality actually increases tenfold. So it's not even consistent throughout. It's just more of a situation where I would say the animations or the facial animations feel a little inconsistent. Now, to end the visuals on a positive note, however, I believe that the use of color from the first to the second game is ramped up way more and it pays off. The sterile blue and white of the school setting or the various browns, greens, and deep reds of the Arizona timeline all mix really well together. Typically speaking, Outlast 2 runs really well. I had a few frame dips on an RTX 3070 Ryzen 7 PC installed on an NVMe, specifically in some of the sequences where it switches from one storyline to the next, but stylistically, these cutscenes and transitions are done so well that I'm not even going to really complain about it, just something I wanted to mention. These dips are never below a solid 60 FPS, so really I'm just being a snob, but it's important to note that maybe for lower hardware that this would be the hardest thing to deal with. And again, technically speaking, and even from a narrative design, these cuts are done so well. And other than a few tonal shifts about 2/3 of the way through the game where it doesn't match up quite perfectly, these scenes are always welcome and I love the transitions between them. Another thing as far as performance is concerned, I played a good portion of this game on Steam Deck at max settings, of course resolution just down to fit the screen, and the game runs stable and maintains that high bar of quality. The smaller screen kind of deals with the resolution concerns, and the game looks pretty great here too. But as Uncle Ben once said, with great visuals comes great audio design. And that's 100% true here too. So with my final section, let's jump right into the sounds and the spookies. Now, for as much as I've been on the fence about a lot of the aspects of this game, one thing that I can say with almost unanimous praise is the sound design. Starting off with the soundtrack and the music that plays throughout the game, it's unsettling, it's high octane during the chase sequences, and it fits every moment that you're in. It can be very subdued when you're exploring and there's not really a lot going on, but still just creepy enough to keep you on edge. But when you reach a scripted sequence where someone walks right around a corner, surprises you, you don't know they're there, and they creep you out, and then you're in a chase sequence, it is so high energy, blood pumping that even for me wearing headphones, I definitely recommend that. It was pretty scary as someone who was kind of, I don't want to say a veteran of horror because I'm fucking 23 years old, but man, I've been playing horror games for a long time, at least 10 years. And I've got to say that sound design is one of the biggest aspects of these games. And continuing with that philosophy, we've also got these sound effects themselves. Whether it be the little digital clicking on the camera as you're switching on different modes and focuses and things like that, or the doors of like a locker or a school door swinging open and kind of bringing back the sounds of your childhood in a way, it's all so much attention to detail that it's pretty insane. Now, you've got your standard issue sounds throughout the course of the game, water flowing, rocks falling, different things like that, and sure, they're just fine. But the other aspect I really wanted to focus on was, I don't want to say the gore sound effects, but anytime there's violence on screen, it really feels like there's an attention there that is above the rest of the game. Whether it be one of the characters actually attacking you in gameplay or during a cutscene where, a lot of like the hands get messed up or anything like that. Anytime the player is damaged, you're going to hear about it, or even other characters within the world, but that's much more rare. To me, this really sells the horror in a way that I don't think visuals alone could, though I have to say, the visuals do a really good job here matching with the audio. Continuing with the idea of gameplay, we've already talked about the audio finding feature on the camera. To me, while the feature was pretty useless in gameplay, I thought the concept and implementation of it was pretty good. The ability to kind of like a sonar, radar, whatever you want to call it, what the cops do, where they point at something far away and they're able to hear it. Basically listen to faraway conversations, or at the very least, look around, scan your environment, and find out where the enemies are, is a really cool feature and something I hope they do continue with in the future. But once again, I hope that the level design kind of benefits that. And while we talked about the soundtrack and the sound effects, the final thing I really wanted to talk about with sound was the voices. Overall, from the first game to this game, voice acting has went up tenfold. Whether it be the fact that the protagonist is now voiced with Blake, or the fact that there's just more characters in the game speaking in general and a much wider variety. For instance, there's no females in the first game. I did find a lot of enjoyment in the voice acting. Lynn, specifically, does a really great job. One thing I always have an issue with in horror is when a character is just screaming. And Lynn, as a female damsel in distress, whatever you want to call her, doesn't necessarily do that, but she has scenes where she's definitely screaming, and the audio keeps up a really high quality, which is harder to do when you're screaming, but it's all done really well. And at those highs and even at the lows of a character like Blake looking over his notes and recordings and giving little bits of speech and different things like that, it's pretty amazing how well the sound design of this game is overall. My biggest complaint with the sound design, and I mean this honest to God, is that one of the the bigger baddies of the game sounds exactly like the female Argonian from the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. And I'm going to play these two clips side by side and tell me, please, I mean it, tell me you see any type of difference.
Those who rebelled against our God shall fall, their infants dashed to pieces.
This way is forgiven. Die, Blue Team coward! You'll never leave this arena alive! You're the best the Blue Team has to offer? Ha!
But as I walk away from this sound design, feeding really well into the visual style of the game, I would like to kind of go into my final verdict. Outlast 2 is the pretty successful sequel to the very successful indie game from 2013. Releasing in 2017, the sequel features a much wider concept overall, focusing more on the religious aspects, and with a ramped up scope and scale, with larger environments, more environments, and even voice acting, I think the game does a pretty good step forward as a sequel to the first game. However, I don't think it's the best implementation of a horror game that I've ever seen. I believe that the story isn't the best thing ever. I think there are redeeming aspects. I think the gameplay, all the improvements made are good, but I don't think most of them are even justified within the gameplay and the level designs. Visually, I think the game runs and works really well and definitely sells the horrific aspects of the game. Bolstering that even further is the audio design, which I think is, bar none, some of the best of a horror game in the sense of voice acting to sound effects and soundtrack. It's got a pretty good ratio with next to no dips in quality here. Overall though, if I were reviewing this game in 2017, I don't know that I would necessarily jump on this game at full price. To me, I don't see paying over $15, maybe $20 for it, depending on how big of a fan of horror you are. Thankfully, hindsight is 2020, or technically 2023 in this instance, and you can pretty much pick the game up on Steam or on sale on most platforms at a cheaper price, and it's going to be a good time. My name is fallinghurts. Thank you for watching this video, and consider subscribing. Look out for news, reviews, and speculation of games in the future. Yeah, that's it, and consider sharing this, and goodbye.